Well, hi. I'd like to talk a little bit about understanding some of the limits and qualifiers of executive function, which are useful when we start thinking about how do we plan interventions to support and scaffold the executive function. We have to realize that it's not infinitely available resource for students. So we're going to look at some of the dimensions of executive function that we take into account as we plan strategies and supports. This is one of my very favorite cartoons about executive function. The parents are saying, "Young man, go to your room and stay there until your cerebral cortex matures." And we know that's not going to happen. But it points out the really salient fact that executive function is one of the very last brain functions to fully mature. We now think that in typical individuals, executive function tends to mature somewhere in your mid-20s, a little earlier for females than males. But we know that for students with diagnosis of ADHD or autism spectrum or a number of affective disorders like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, that maturation curve is even longer. So, I like to say that think about when insurance rates for young drivers go down, about age 25, right? That's because our actuarians understood about executive function, slow maturing executive function, way before our neuropsychologists did. And if we want to look at this maturity curve, in a typical learner, in this case, it's a female learner, I like the way this visual correlates the maturing parts of the brain, and in this diagram, in this visual, blue represents increasing levels of maturity. And you can see if we're looking at the prefrontal cortex, there's not a lot of blue to begin with. And when we're in our early years, age 5, age 12 maybe, age 16, age 20, these brains are representing the levels of maturity of the young woman at these various ages. It's not until we start getting into our 20s that significant portions of the prefrontal cortex are fully matured and online. And as I said, for individuals with autism spectrum issues or attention deficit diagnosis, the thinking is that they mature at about two-thirds the rate of their chronological peers. So what does that mean? Think about an 18-year-old college freshman going off to college, away from home, maybe for the first time, away from the structure and support of parents and the highly structured high school environment. And if you're an 18-year-old with attention deficit or ASD, what's two-thirds of 18? 12. It means they have the executive function maturity comparable to a typically maturing 12-year-old. And when you think about the incredible differences of what our expectations are for 12-year-olds compared to 18-year-olds, you begin to see why so many students have a hard time in college just sticking with the program and completing their first year successfully. It's not because they're not smart. It's because they don't have the fully matured executive function to manage the new demands of a much less structured, autonomous kind of environment. We also know that self-regulation is a limited resource in other ways. There's a fabulous article by Baumeister in 2011, which is entitled Executive Function, Willpower. Willpower, it's not just a metaphor. And they discuss how, physiologically speaking, our brain is run on glucose. That's the fuel that fuels the brain. And our brains use a very large, I think 75% of our glucose stores during the day. And our and executive functions call on and use up much more glucose than other more automatic thinking tasks. So we saw that it increases, executive function ability increases as we mature, and also through practice, deliberate adoption of strategies and attention paid to executive function. But it decreases temporarily with use. And what that means is if we get sufficient sleep and we're well rested, when we wake up in the morning, one of the things that sleep does for us is that when we wake up in the morning, we have a full fuel tank, so to speak. We have our maximum daily stores of glucose available to fuel brain function. But throughout the day, as we practice restraining an impulse, like not leaning on the horn for that stupid driver in front of us on the road, or resisting gooey Danish pastry for breakfast if we're trying to be more nutritious in how we eat, or we have to solve a knotty problem, or be in a socially complex situation. As we as we practice our executive function activities throughout the day, we're actually drawing down that glucose fuel tank so that by the end of the day, our levels are at their lowest point. And this is why if you've ever tried to be on a diet or an exercise program and you were able to successfully resist temptation throughout the day, your willpower may not be up to the task of resisting that delicious chocolate chip cookie at 8 o'clock in the evening when you sit down in front of the television set. During the day, so our glucose stores are consumed during the day. They are refueled by sleep. So naps are excellent. By additional glucose, sugary drinks are actually very successful in refueling the tank, but also exercise and more nutritious snacks that have sugar like fruit are able to increase the available stores of glucose during the day. By the way, we know that executive function does increase and fully matures in our mid-20s, but just a word to the wise, it starts to decline for most of us in our 40s. So, catch it while you can. Some other facts to keep in mind is that the dopamine reward pathways for activities that we decide we want to do, we've chosen, are different than the reward pathways for engaging in tasks that have been assigned to us. So that explains a little bit why students may be able to stay highly focused and engaged with a stimulating activity that they thoroughly enjoy, video games, anime, maybe an actual playing a sport out on the field. And they can do that for hours on end, but sit down in front of a page of math problems or a dense history reading assignment, and they've run out of fuel and steam right away because the reward pathways are not as highly activated by tasks that we have not personally chosen. And with that in mind, knowing what is developmentally appropriate for our students at different ages is the last thing that we need to be fully aware of as we plan strategies and interventions. Certainly, it does not help to expect students to do things that are developmentally beyond their capacity. That will only lead to frustration. There's a very good delineation of what's developmentally appropriate in this wonderful book by Dawson and Guar called Smart But Scattered. There's also Smart But Scattered Teens, and I highly recommend these books if you're looking for extremely practical scripts and tools for helping students develop executive function. So if we look at grades 3 to 5, chores that take 15 to 30 minutes, we can expect students to sustain their effort that long. If they're typically maturing, to start bringing books and papers back and forth between school and home, keeping track of their belongings when they're away from home, not losing every mitten that comes their way. To work independently or with a little scaffolded support on homework tasks, mental tasks up to an hour in length. To plan a relatively simple project like a book report, read one book and follow a format for this project. To track their daily schedules, it changes. That is, knowing maybe they have soccer practice after school on Mondays, but religious school on Wednesdays, and being more or less on top of that with relatively few reminders. And in terms of behavioral expectations, the teacher needs to step out of the room for a few moments, not going off the deep end and start dancing on their desks, to be able to control impulsive, rude comments and things like temper tantrums. As students move on into middle school, we can expect them to start using a system for organizing their schoolwork, keeping track of their assignments, keeping notebooks and course materials organized in some way so they can find what they need when they need it. And to follow the more complex schedule that is typical in middle school, where they're not in the same homeroom classroom all day with the same teacher, but moving around a school, a campus with a variety of teachers and maybe a slightly differing schedule every day. At this age, we want them to be able to plan and carry out some long-term projects, and maybe doing a math project at the same time that you're doing a history project, and not be completely overwhelmed. To be able to show a little independence in figuring out how they're going to use their after-school time, if they have any that's not already scheduled by their parents, which today is not that common. To start being aware of how long they can expect a task or a chore to take, and allocating the proper amount of time for that. And again, when the teacher or the parent or the authority steps out of the room, to not completely lose their behavioral guidelines and start acting out. In other words, to exercise a good amount of self-control. And then finally, as students mature into high school, we hope that they're going to be able to manage their schoolwork in a much more autonomous way, to complete both long and short-term assignments on time, to know where to find them and hand them in, to be able to study for tests and not all of that cramming at the last minute. And also to start developing personal goals and ways to meet them, which probably include things like having significant after-school activities, passions, projects, hobbies, favorite activities, balancing them, maybe even having a job. And of course, these are the danger years when students start getting tempted to do high-risk behavior like drugs, driving too fast, engaging in extreme sports. So to be able to start developing their own personal guidelines that inhibit reckless or dangerous behaviors.